Can we get a roll call, please?
Thank you and good evening. Commissioner Tevana. Councilmember Sayak.
Here.
Commissioner O'Donnell. Councilmember Spector.
Here.
Commissioner Badami.
Here.
Councilmember Rennie.
Here.
Commissioner Janoff.
Here.
Vice Mayor Jensen.
Here.
Commissioner Hanson.
Here.
Mayor and Chair Leonardis.
Here. First order of business is verbal communications. If any member of the public wishes to speak on items not on the agenda, please feel free to come forward now. I see no one speaking this evening in verbal, so we'll go ahead and close that. We'll move right on to our business item of the evening, which is a discussion of the vehicle miles traveled metric for the environmental review and local transportation analysis. Mr. Morley, will you be giving us the report?
I will start us off. Thank you.
Thank you.
So this is an opportunity for us to provide you with a bunch of information and get us started on the conversation on VMT, vehicle miles traveled. We'll be working through this with you over the next several months with a implementation sort of mid-time of next calendar year. We've brought on Farron Pierce to help us with this. Farron Pierce is one of the experts in the field. And with us tonight to make the presentation and to help answer the questions is Ron Milam, and he'll take us through most of the presentation.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here. In terms of the presentation tonight, it takes about 20 to 30 minutes to get through the material.
If you could bring the microphone just a little higher, we'll make sure it's operating correctly.
Turning it on. That better. So we have in the presentation about 20 to 30 minutes of material, depending on whether or not you want to ask questions as we go. There is a lot of new material that you may not be familiar with, so I'd encourage you to ask questions as we go to make sure that anything you need clarified is done so as we go. Let's start with some outline information here. We want to cover some basic background material, and this is going to be related to how CEQA functions and how 743 changes some aspects of the law and what we do in practice. We're also going to want to explain some technical details about the new metric vehicle miles traveled, also called VMT. So you'll hear me refer to that acronym throughout the presentation. And then what we want to walk you through is some of the decisions that every lead agency has to make in the state. So every city and county is a lead agency under the California Environmental Quality Act. And so to implement the new law, there's a number of decisions that you have to make before we get to basically a fundamental change in the way you're going to do environmental review. And the decisions fall into these categories here, A through D. What is the methodology you're going to use to forecast VMT from projects? Do you want to use a screening process to apply a very simple review for projects that are small, potentially, that you may be able to presume are less than significant just based on a limited amount of information? And then to the extent that we're trying to determine impacts, we need thresholds. What's an acceptable level of VMT change versus what's unacceptable? And you have a lot of discretion there to choose your own. And then mitigation, if there are impacts, how would you like to see those impacts mitigated? So those are all specific decisions. And then there'll be plenty of time for discussion. So in terms of background, we want to put 743 in the context of other state laws. So if we back all the way up to 2006 and AB 32, that was basically the state's first recognition of climate change and wanting to take a state-level approach to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. It was followed pretty quickly by SB 97 that we have highlighted on the slide. SB 97 was the first time that the legislature decided that we had to analyze a specific metric in CEQA, and that was greenhouse gases. Up until that point, lead agencies had a lot of discretion to decide for themselves what metrics and what types of analysis should be performed for different technical areas dealing with the environment. And then we had a lot of other laws that came along, a lot of them reinforcing some of the greenhouse gas focus of the state. I want to mention SB 375 real quickly. When the state went through what's called the scoping plan to understand how to reduce greenhouse gases from the different sectors that generate it, like electricity production, travel, land use, and transportation, for example, they realized that trying to deal with the land use and transportation sectors was very challenging So they delegated it to the metropolitan planning organizations in the state, MTC here in the Bay Area, for example, and said, this is challenging. We're going to hand it off to you regional agencies and work with your member agencies on how to achieve reductions. And so there was a recognition by the state that this stuff is hard to deal with, especially in terms of trying to influence land use decisions or our transportation network decisions. You can basically look at this as it's best dealt with at the local level where land use control resides. Let's fast forward to SB 743 and what the state's now doing. So it was actually passed back in 2013. So it's been a long time in the implementation process at the state level, trying to work through all the details, work with all the stakeholders and interest groups. And what's unique about 743 compared to something like SB 97, SB 97, the state gave us a new metric. They didn't tell us how to analyze it. They didn't give us thresholds. They didn't give us guidance. And so we've been fighting it basically in the courts since SB 97 passed in terms of what is an appropriate threshold, for example. They didn't want that to happen again with SB 743, so the statute actually directs OPR, the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, to basically develop guidance and recommendations for thresholds. And that's part of what took the state so long to get through the process. So they've now done that. They've given us recommendations on different methodology, different threshold options, and they've put this in a combination of important documents. One is the CEQA guidelines. So we have the CEQA statute, and then we have the CEQA guidelines that help us implement the statute. That document's now been updated and certified by the state. And there's also another document called a technical advisory, where a lot of this additional information resides. That's where you get information about methodology, threshold options that will directly relate to the choices that you have before you. So this is kind of a big change. This is the state becoming much more active in the environmental legislation and directing lead agencies like yourself to take into consideration things like a specific metric that are important to the state. So one of the things that happens in our practice is because CEQA allows different parties to bring legal challenges, a lot of our projects do get legally challenged. That's not because we're bad consultants, it's just the nature of the projects we like to take on and in working in a litigious state like California. And what we've learned about those court cases is that oftentimes the legislative intent is very important to helping the judges understand what was intended by the legislature. And so there's a few lines in here that I think are important to point out. In the first one, it sounds somewhat mundane, just to ensure that the environmental impacts of traffic, such as noise and air pollution and safety concerns, continue to be properly addressed. What we want to call out here that's important, if you think about all the different environmental impacts that occur and we address in CEQA today, you can categorize them. Some of them fall into the natural resource environment. We're affecting the biology of an area, for example. Others fall into the human environment. We affect the humans. And we're supposed to consider things like air pollution, safety. Those are things related to the human environment. And so when you think about traffic and the way we've analyzed it up till this point, you may be familiar with the term level of service. It's a measure of intersection delay or delay to drivers. And so that kind of delay also has an effect on humans. But the state has basically said level of service is no longer going to be used in CEQA analysis. So basically they're removing it from CEQA analysis and replacing it with VMT. And we'll get into some more of those details here in a minute. But the state is using the law here to basically change the way that practice has traditionally happened with CEQA for us transportation analysts. In the past, cities have largely had the discretion to pick your metrics, pick your methodology, and now the state has stepped in and not just given us a new metric in the form of VMT, but they've taken one away. We're not allowed to use level of service in CEQA. You can still use it for other purposes, such as your general plan that I know you're going through an update on. So this is an important distinction. And then finally, in this part 2 here, the state wants to more appropriately balance the needs of congestion management with statewide goals related to infill development, promotion of public health through active transportation, and the reduction of greenhouse gases. So everything that we do in making the decisions for methodology and thresholds, we need to look through this lens. We need to understand what we're trying to accomplish when we make those decisions. So what does the law actually do? What are the key components? Well, I've mentioned the first one here, eliminates vehicle level service. So we're no longer looking at impacts to drivers. We're now going to focus on VMT and the impact of driving itself. VMT is a proxy, if you will, for things like fuel consumption and emissions. It's also a proxy for things like safety. And so it is, from an environmental perspective, a metric that measures more than just the delay to drivers. In adding VMT as a significant metric and threshold, you're having to make a choice about what level of VMT change in your community is going to be unacceptable. It's one of the most difficult decisions you will have to make as we go through the process. It's one thing to think about level of service and what level of delay is unacceptable. You can relate it to your own experience of going through a signalized intersection, for example. Most people don't want to have to wait for 2 complete cycles to get through the intersection, or sometimes longer. With VMT, what level of reduction from how people drive today should be considered acceptable versus unacceptable is the basic question. And the state's given us recommendations, and we'll walk through those in a moment. As I mentioned, the state was directed OPR to develop guidance on methods and thresholds, so they did that. This also fundamentally changes where impacts occur. If you've dealt with a development project in the past and you've reviewed its transportation impacts, typically the way we measured them was away from the project. It's all the cars going through the local intersections nearby. We analyzed intersections away from the project, and we would mitigate those. Well, under 743, when you talk about vehicle miles of travel, you don't change the network away from the project. You try to change the project itself. You change its built environment characteristics, like the density of the land use, or you add things like a transportation demand management program, maybe require the applicant to provide transit pass subsidies to the tenants of, let's say, an office building. So this is a pretty fundamental change to the way we've traditionally done transportation impact analysis in the state. Now, it's also important to explain what 743 doesn't do. If you think about how planning and environmental review works in the state, you can think of them as 2 parallel paths. When a development application comes in, there's 2 things you're basically doing with it. You're reviewing it against your entitlement review process, and that typically means consistency with your general plan, consistency with your zoning. We call that kind of the entitlement process. Then there's environmental review, complying with the California Environmental Quality Act. So 743 deals with the environmental review process. It doesn't change what you do for entitlement review. If you want to continue using level service through your general plan, for example, you can continue to do that. If you have things like an impact fee program, you can continue using level service for that. So it doesn't remove your basic police powers for protecting public health and safety and using level service as a metric as part of that process. In terms of the status and where we're at, 2013 was when the law was signed by the governor. Spent a lot of times at the state level trying to work through some of the implementation details. The CEQA guidelines were updated and certified on December 28th, 2018. The law technically went into effect April 27th, 2019. But the state, in updating the CEQA guidelines, basically gave a grace period that said you don't have to implement VMT as your new metric until July 1st, 2020. So you still have time before you're mandated to use VMT. In the meantime, though, you're not supposed to be using level service. Upon certification of the guidelines, vehicle level service as an appropriate metric in CEQA went away. So July 1st, 2020 is kind of the date everyone is now focused on. Right, here's where we get to all the fun stuff. Basically, what is VMT? What is this metric that I keep referring to? I'm going to try and keep it really simple. And even though it's only 2 variables typically, it's the number of vehicle trips to or from a site multiplied by the length of those trips, how far they go. Only 2 variables. It's real easy to make it a lot more complicated than that. And we end up making it a little bit more complicated because sometimes where the trips go, how fast they go, also matter. We use VMT today for more than just transportation impact analysis. It's our fundamental input to things like air quality analysis, energy consumption, and greenhouse gas analysis. So the speed of the VMT can also matter. But in this little plot here that you see on the screen, this is one way to visualize VMT. This is a city, and what we're doing is keeping track of all the trips that have at least one trip end in the city. I mean, you either started your trip there or you ended your trip there. Some people could have done both without leaving the city limits. And we track them through the network. That allows us to not only keep track of the number of trips, but also the distance. And we roll that up and we can come up with a citywide total to give you a total number of VMT. We can also express that VMT in a number of different ways. We call it efficiency metrics, VMT per capita. So you can think of that as dividing the VMT by your population. We can do that per employee, express it in lots of different ways. And sometimes expressing it in that form is helpful in comparing two different land use scenarios, for example. So we'll spend a little more time on that in a moment. One of the things that I think is really important about VMT and telling very complete stories, especially for elected officials and the public, is going to be this next slide. Two terms that you're going to want to get really familiar with, and we'll have pictures here in a moment to help. Project-generated VMT, that's the simple one I just talked about, number of vehicle trips multiplied by the trip length. That's what gives you project-generated VMT. And then this other term, project effect on VMT. That's going to take a little more time to explain, and this is where the pictures will help. So I want to picture 3 existing neighborhoods. They only have one grocery store in all 3 neighborhoods. And so today, everyone has to drive or travel to the grocery store there in the purple neighborhood. So what happens if a town gets an application to build another grocery store? So they're going to add this little grocery store over in the gray neighborhood. And so if you look in this first picture, the gray neighborhood, everyone has to drive very long distances to the one grocery store in the purple neighborhood. But this new proposal is going to give them their own store. And because they get their own store, they're still making the same number of shopping trips. We haven't changed population. We haven't changed the income or discretionary income for shopping. There's just a new location that this development project has created for people to shop closer to home. And so as a result, if we measure project-generated VMT, you can see there's 3 little trips going to and from that site. Each of those trips has a trip length. And so it does generate new VMT. And so we would calculate that and put that in the analysis. The project effect on VMT is not so simple, because that neighborhood is already making these long-distance trips to the original grocery store. We need to account for that in the project effect on VMT. Individual projects can affect their neighbors, basically. So in this example, the long-distance trips get replaced by short-distance trips, and the net effect for the whole neighborhood, or what we call the project effect on VMT, is actually a decrease. As elected officials and the public trying to understand this, it's important that we tell the complete story. And that story involves not just the amount of traffic that's being generated by the project, but that effect on the neighbors. So these are some of the considerations that you have to take into to think about when you are making a decision about methodology. You could choose just to analyze project-generated VMT. The state guidance, in fact, allows for that. But that would ignore the potential project effect on the neighborhood. It would be very important for you to have a complete story in making these kinds of decisions. All right, so let's also think about how VMT is already used. I mentioned that we already use it in the analysis of air quality, greenhouse gases, and energy. When you think about how far cars are traveling, you can use that to calculate the amount of fuel they're consuming and the amount of emissions they're generating, or the amount of energy that's being consumed. So we already use it in these other 3 sections. When we analyze it in those other 3 sections, we typically don't want to leave any VMT out. We're accounting for typically all the different vehicles that go to and from a site, all the reasons they might want to go there. And so you can think of it as a total VMT, and we typically measure it for a weekday. So the new use of VMT in CEQA analysis, one of the questions that CEQA attorneys like to ask us, well, you're going to use the same type of VMT, right? We don't want to have VMT in 4 chapters and in this new chapter have it be a different number. That would be hard to explain. Unfortunately, the state guidance gave us a different number. They've recommended some different forms of the variable, and those forms are not consistent with what we've done traditionally in practice. So those are some of the things that you're going to have to work through when you start getting into the details of your decision making. Is how do we do VMT analysis today, And should we maintain consistency with the way we've done it, making sure that you've done your best efforts to account for both project-generated VMT, the project effect on VMT, and doing an accounting of all the trips that go to and from the site, regardless of what type of vehicle they were moved in. So here are those decisions kind of broken down for you in a little bit more detail. I mentioned OPR created the technical advisory. That's the cover there on the right. This is the state's recommendations. They don't carry the weight of law like the CEQA guidelines. This is just the state's advice. So you need to think about it and consider it. It is evidence, and typically in CEQA, we always want to look at evidence when we're making decisions. But the specific decisions you have to make on the VMT methodology, you actually have to pick the form of the metric. Do you want to just focus on total VMT? Do you want to use an efficiency form of the metric, VMT per capita, for example? Comparing those sometimes is a little easier than looking at total numbers. And then what model or tool? One of the things that's happened with this very bright focus on VMT, it does require us to use models. So it's put a lot more spotlight, if you will, on the types of models and tools that we use in practice and how we determine if they're adequate for CEQA purposes. So that's something that will get a little bit more scrutiny because we have this brand new law coming into implementation and something that maybe didn't get as much scrutiny in the past. Secondly, we've got thresholds. In CEQA analysis, we usually have thresholds relevant to both project analysis, that's typically your baseline or existing conditions plus the project being added, and then cumulative conditions. What happens when you consider other reasonably foreseeable projects over a longer period of time? This will be one of the more difficult parts of the decision-making process. What is an acceptable level of VMT change? And if you think of most communities, they typically have some amount of growth between current conditions and 20 years in the future. It can be a very small amount, in some cases a very large amount, but they've planned for it in their general plan, and they've typically identified where that land use goes. They've made decisions in their circulation element of the general plan as how to support that with transportation network improvements. The combination of all those basically creates VMT as an output. So every city and county in the state has already gone through a general plan process at one point or another and has already deemed a certain amount of VMT growth acceptable based on the general plan. Now, that process may not have considered state goals for greenhouse gas reduction or other information the state has produced related to the expectations for greenhouse gas and VMT reduction. So that's something new that most agencies are trying to work through in setting thresholds. In terms of screening, that's another choice. The state has decided that it would be useful to screen out of analysis certain types of projects that the state deems desirable. Infill housing projects, especially those located next to high-quality transit. We call those transit priority areas. Typically, they're rail stations, ferry stations, or where you have peak 15-minute bus service, especially if you have two lines crossing each other. Those are areas the state has said we should streamline the development review. If your project, especially residential projects, are located in that type of area, check the box, no further analysis is required. But that's a discretionary decision for every lead agency as to whether or not you want to follow the state's guidance. And then finally, feasible mitigation. I mentioned that we're shifting the mitigation focus away from intersections and the network that's adjacent to a project to the project itself. We're going to basically propose changes to projects, or we're going to add transportation demand management strategies. The Bay Area has used TDM for years, lots of good examples of using TDM. The challenge of doing TDM as mitigation for CEQA, what most cities and counties are used to when it comes to transportation impact studies based on level service is when I come up to the podium to give you a presentation about the project mitigation, if we have a level service impact, it's not uncommon for us to propose something like adding capacity, adding a second left turn lane. And if the city chooses to add that second left turn lane, we can more or less guarantee the outcome, that the level of service will get better. It's a physical improvement. It provides more capacity intersection. So we've set a benchmark for ourselves in practice that we should literally be able to guarantee the outcome. And the basic structure of CEQA is that we should be able to have a high level of confidence in our mitigation. If we don't, we typically have to conclude that even with mitigation, impacts may be significant. So with most transportation demand management strategies, the thing you have to be prepared for if you use it as mitigation is it's often dependent on the building tenants. So think of entitling an office project. When you do the entitlement, you won't know who the office building tenants will be, and building tenants may change over time. The same TDM strategy, like a transit pass subsidy, may work 1 year and may not work the next. So typically, if we use TDM, it requires us to rely on monitoring to make sure that impact remains less than significant over a longer period of time. So that's oftentimes a difficult decision for a city to struggle with, because it's putting either an additional cost burden on the development applicant or the city itself to perform that monitoring. So just some words of wisdom when it comes to these decisions. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of the projects that I work on in particular are ones that have been sued or will be sued, and so we always try to look through the legal lens in terms of making sure we have substantial evidence to support all the decisions that a lead agency may make. And one of the things we try to do in that process is also look at the past court decisions and to understand what are the CEQA expectations for something like this when we're dealing with technical methodology about models, setting thresholds, and choosing feasible mitigation. And CEQA has some pretty high expectations. Fullest possible protection of the environment, full disclosure, adequately investigated, best efforts to find out and disclose. The courts consistently remind us that when it comes to environmental protection, we're going to hold the bar high in terms of expectations when it comes to the decisions that lead agencies make, whether it's for methodology, thresholds, or the mitigation. So keeping that in mind, one of those choices you'll have to make is on the form of VMT. I mentioned earlier, in current practice, we typically try to use total VMT, account for all the trips to and from the site. That also depends on the types of models that we use. Some jurisdictions have access to more sophisticated models that have more capabilities. But one of the things I want to do is show you some different ways that the metric can be used, and show you how the availability of different models may influence this. So on the left is something that we call household VMT. This is the VMT generated by, let's say, a single family home. And let's use the example of the picture on the left here. Let's say this single family home only has one person living in it. We'll call her Jess. And on a typical day, Jess leaves the home, goes to the coffee shop, 2 miles, then drives 10 miles to work, followed by an 11-mile trip home. That's the first part of Jess's day, or something we would call the work tour. Later in the evening, she leaves the home again to go get gas, goes out to the grocery store, and then returns home. That's more of a shopping tour. If we add up all the miles of Jess's trip for the day, we've got 29 miles. Our more sophisticated models have the capability of doing that exact accounting. It keeps track of all the trips wherever Jess went during the whole day, and it'll do it for every member of the household. In less sophisticated models, we're limited to what we call trip-based calculations. We know that Jess lives in a single-family home, and we know how many trips go to and from that home. We don't have information about what happens after Jess leaves the home and is doing trips to or from her work location, for example. And so we call this home-based VMT. Every trip is measured to or from the home. And in that type of accounting, we can't keep track of the entire day. And the number of miles, therefore, is less. And so we want to keep this in mind if we're using this in our environmental impact practices, which one of these methods we're using and what we might not be including. In some cases for screening, the state has recommended that we could simply look at the home-based work trip. So in Jess's case, there's only one pure home-based work trip where the home and the work location are the start and end of the trip. In the example in the morning, Jess actually went to the coffee shop first, and then she went from the coffee shop to work. That's not a home-based work trip where you're going directly from home to work. But that home-based work trip typically is the longest trip someone will make. If you think of the types of trips we make on a daily basis, the ones that tend to be the longest are the ones that we derive the most value from. Going to the coffee shop, we have to spend money, but we get the value of a good cup of coffee. Driving to work, we get to derive an income. Someone pays us to show up. So those are the trips we tend to make the longest, and it's a good proxy for what the total amount of VMT might be for a project if you want to use screening in a much simplified method. Any questions up to this point? Everyone's just following along? All right. Just a little bit more on screening. The state has really promoted screening because, again, the state has some objectives. Some of it is related to environmental protection, greenhouse gas reduction. Some of it is related to trying to encourage housing. And so from the state's perspective, they are trying to find ways that for projects that meet the state's definition of desirability, they are trying to make the environmental review process, at least for transportation, as simple as possible. So one way to do that is based on project size. I mentioned another way is based on project location next to a transit stop. We can also map areas that tend to be low VMT generating. So typically when you put homes in higher density and you put them in mixed use environments, those tend to allow you to make walk or bike trips, or if you do have to take a car, that's just a very short trip. Those areas tend to be the kinds of places the state wants to encourage more development. And then provision of affordable housing. The state has also recommended that if someone is building affordable housing, that they also get the benefits of this screening process. Now, in any of these screening steps, one of the issues that has already come up in a number of other agencies that we're working with is a lot of the places, infill sites or even transit priority areas in communities, even those that are desirable places from the state's perspective, there are neighbors there. And those neighbors may have concerns about the environmental impacts, whether they're from transportation or other parts of the environment. And so those projects actually oftentimes get a lot of scrutiny from the local community. So the screening is something that is optional, and it may not be right for every community. Now, a lot of words here on establishing thresholds. And I think to try and simplify this idea that there's a certain amount of VMT that's acceptable in the community, and then at some point you get above this threshold and there would potentially be an impact. That's one of the toughest decisions to make, and as I've pointed out a few times now. One thing I want to do to try and simplify it is when you think about VMT, there are certain ways to kind of process it. We're going back to the pictures of Jess and her daily travel. Some of our travel is what we would call productive. It's part of and very beneficial to the economy, Jess going to work. So her work travel falls into that productive sector. There's other trips we make that are what we call sustaining. We're going to the grocery store. We need food. Sometimes we need to buy clothes. We may need to improve our shelter. So we have productive VMT, and then we have sustaining VMT. Then there's VMT that's much more discretionary. We're doing maybe recreational or social things, not that they don't have value, but there's a little bit more discretion to them. So that's one way to think about VMT and where you might start to draw lines about what amount of VMT or what type of VMT is acceptable or unacceptable. The state of California, through the OPR guidance, has recommended that new development be held to a threshold of at least 15% below whatever the VMT generation of current land uses are. So if you think of this as a typical single-family home, and they're generating a certain amount of VMT today, a new developer would be expected to create a development that generates 15% less than that existing development. And there are some different numbers depending on which state resource you use. OPR is recommended 15%. ARB has weighed in on this question as well, and based on the state's goals for greenhouse gas reduction, has suggested OPR's number is a little low, that 16.8% would be a more appropriate number. And one of the difficulties of setting any kind of number is it's based on modeling. So ARB had to run some models to figure out in the year 2050, a long ways from now, how much VMT reduction is necessary to meet greenhouse gas goals. Those models all have limitations. Some of the biggest challenges we face today in the forecasting world is what we don't know coming from disruptive trends, internet shopping, transportation network companies like Uber and Lyft. By 2050, things like autonomous vehicles. All those are things that potentially move the needle up or down on VMT. including things like fuel prices. We've had a lot of fluctuation in California just based on fuel prices. So these are variables that are very difficult for us to predict with any kind of certainty, but they have a big influence on VMT and the expectations you might have for an appropriate threshold. In terms of the feasible mitigation, I hinted at some of these. We tend to break them into two categories, what we call the built environment. You'll see this little acronym here, the 7 Ds. We have a number of built environment variables. They typically fall in the category of things like land use density, land use diversity, a mix of uses, distance to transit. The closer you are to transit, for example, typically the lower the VMT. And so you can oftentimes, in working with a project applicant, have some influence on the built environment. But this is something that you have to be careful with, because if you make too big a change, you fundamentally change the applicant's project. And that's not what CEQA requires. It doesn't require you to analyze a different project. We're trying to make small tweaks typically when we apply the built environment type changes, and they still have to be feasible for the project applicant. Then there's the transportation and management strategies, TDM, that we've talked about. You know, definitely a challenge here with the building tenant dependency that we've hinted at. And then this fact that you may have to monitor it for it to be truly effective. There are some new things evolving in the TDM space. We've been doing new research with ARB to create menus of all the different strategies. And there are ways to take those strategies and build them into things like an impact fee program. City of LA has done that. They have an impact fee program that's building bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure based on a VMT reduction goal as the nexus for the fee program. There's also new programs emerging called mitigation banks and mitigation exchanges. UC Berkeley is doing some research on this. The idea is that there are certain types of projects that are VMT reducers, bicycle pedestrian improvements, for example. And it may be possible through an exchange program for a developer to agree to build one of these projects. And so what you need kind of in between is a facilitator to match up the VMT generator, the development project, with the VMT reducer, which could be a project in the same jurisdiction or possibly even in another jurisdiction. Those are some of the more creative ideas that are evolving. That's the big overview. There are some next steps here that Matt's going to walk you through in terms of the overall process.
So thank you for that. We know there's a ton of information that we provided to you, which is why we've outlined a number of next steps. Again, our hope tonight is to introduce this topic to you, to overwhelm you with information and the decisions that are coming forward, hopefully to answer some of your questions now, to identify the areas of focus that you might have over the course of the evening, and then in steps to bring this back to you in packages that are hopefully a little easier to handle sort of one at a time, with the ultimate conclusion of adopting in May some final policies. So we've got some outlined dates for when we'll be coming back to you. That's flexible, and we may move those around depending on where your interests lie and where we may be able to bundle some things based on that. So with that concludes the presentation, and it's your show, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Morley. Councilmember Sayoc.
So I have tons of questions, but so the first thing, let me start one per area. So the threshold. As lead agency in the past level of service, we look at the effect onto our city streets. What's with threshold and given 375, is it expanding so that we're looking at the threshold and the VMTs on a larger basis than within our city limits? I'm trying to understand, because you give the example of home to work. Oftentimes, home is not in the same city as work. And so how does one start to analyze the VMTs when it ends at your city's boundaries?
Yeah, so one of the recommendations from OPR was that we should not truncate trip lengths at a political boundary. We need to do a full accounting of the trip end and the trip beginning and the route in between. So in this case, this is from Citrus Heights in Sacramento. And this is the entire Sacramento region, so we're keeping track of their trips throughout the entire Sacramento region. Technically, this is not sufficient because some of those trips actually come to the Bay Area, and we're truncating them at the SACOG regional boundary. So one of the things we're doing with our models, I mentioned before, we're now under this new spotlight, and people are looking at this saying, you know, you really shouldn't be truncating the trips, and you need to have this full accounting. So yes, we are using much larger models, regional models, if you will, to do some of this analysis. And OPR in their threshold recommendations has suggested a couple of benchmarks for a city, for example, could be to the VMT generated at the city average level or the regional average. Well, if it's at the city or regional average, you need a model big enough to calculate that. So that would have to be use of things like the MTC model or maybe the VTA model, even for a small town.
And then a second question to that. So then if you're looking at the methodology to choose, wouldn't it depend on the type of usage, whether it's home to work, home to grocery store, home to, like, do you set that, do you make those decisions up front, or is it per project type?
You would want to think in advance of all the different project types and the longest amount of those trips. So typically those commute trips can be the longest ones, unless you're in an area that has a lot of visitors, like we're doing work in Tahoe. Well, they draw people from the Bay Area, for example, and even farther away. And their model today is just the Lake Tahoe Basin. They're literally going to have to expand the limits of their model to capture, you know, Sacramento and the Bay Area. So you have to think through that process. What is the full travel shed for our community, and try and chase those trips as far as reasonable. Now, CEQA doesn't mandate that you're perfect. It kind of mandates you try real hard. So there is, you know, some limits there in terms of what's reasonable based on the data available and those kinds of things.
Commissioner Hanson.
So a question I had a couple questions, and then I won't ask any more in case others do. But it surprises me that there's going to be that much leniency given to having different standards by agency. Just using the example that you gave us about the, you could use it based on the project generated versus the project effect on VMT. And how is that going to make CEQA a good standard for evaluating project if Los Gatos chooses to do project effect on VMT and Saratoga does something else? And so that was the first question I had.
Yeah, so when OPR put together their technical advisory, again, they're looking at through the state's perspective. Most of their recommendations for this project-generated approach was based on the concept of screening. 95% of the document is basically helping you to understand how to do a screening process. And it doesn't tell you how to do a complete analysis if a project doesn't get screened out, but it gives you some hints. It suggests that you should account for the full effect of the project. That's stated in only one sentence, though. So what we've done is, because we understand the models, we've interpreted it to mean you really do want to capture this project effect, and that it really shouldn't be discretionary. If a project is not screened out of analysis and you have to do a complete analysis, you want both. But it's not mandated. It is a discretion, and with your discretion comes CEQA risk. Our advice would be, if you don't do it, it would be easy for someone that's, you know, opposed to a project to point out the limitation of your methodology and that you didn't fully account for the full effect of the project. So to the extent that some of the recommendations that the state's making have to be viewed through what is an adequacy lens, because when you do an environmental document, there is always that risk of challenge. So we could end up with two jurisdictions right next to each other, picking different methodology, one that's less risk tolerant than the other. That's entirely possible.
So related to that, you know, now when we do CEQA, we hire a consultant to do the, and that's one of the complaints that I've seen a lot on Planning Commission is that the consultant will come in and they'll use numbers from 10 years ago or something like that, you know, as a generator kind of thing. So what is the transportation consulting industry doing to support this process?
So the industry is probably represented a few different ways. There is one group called the Institute of Transportation Engineers. out of San Diego. They created a task force on 743 and have been actively involved since the original legislation passed, and they've provided comments along the way. There's been a fair number of other practitioners like ourselves that have been involved, actually working directly with OPR, with Caltrans, with ARB, helping to develop some of the guidance and actually building better models for implementation. But to your kind of fundamental point here in terms of what are those expectations and kind of what needs to change more or less, I think a lot of this comes down to CEQA risk. A lot of places that we find old data used or the technical practices not keeping pace with the industry. And if you think of our industry, it changes every year. We have something called the Transportation Research Board. There's an annual meeting every January in Washington, D.C., and there's thousands of new technical papers published. And there's typically new guidance coming from FHWA or Caltrans almost every year on subject matter. So we're always evolving. So if you see a technical practice that's 10 years old, it's probably definitely out of date. So what you find in practice with CEQA, though, is for communities that don't have a legal risk, no one's going to be opposed to the projects. They've done things a certain way. They've gotten used to it. It's consistent. And they have very little legal risk. And so they don't have sometimes the incentive to update to the more expensive model, use the best available data because it's going to cost more. So we find that technical practices throughout the state, it's a really big state with lots of different levels of CEQA risk involved, and therefore you get big variations in actual practice, whether you're in Southern California or Northern California. And that's just kind of the reality of kind of how things have played out over the decades.
Okay, thanks.
Councilmember Rennie.
Thank you. I'm trying to understand if there's really a change. When I first heard about VMT, I was thinking the purpose is to try to get us thinking more regionally, not just what's going on in our little area. Let me give you an extreme example. Let's say I'm Google and I want to add 20,000 employees. I could just put some more on Shoreline Boulevard, make Shoreline bigger, increase the off-ramp size, even add some lanes on 101 maybe. It's all very focused on that area. Or I could think, well, why don't I reduce the total miles traveled and I put it in downtown San Jose, closer to where most of the people live, closer to where there's more transit. That's what I thought this was about, but if I'm starting to wonder if that's really going to work, because you've got different jurisdictions, so I'm talking about different cities now that have different thresholds, different rules, it sounds like, maybe even using different models. And then you kind of talked about, okay, how do I analyze if somebody brings me a project? I'm not thinking in terms of, geez, you should have stuck this over there kind of thing. I'm thinking, okay, how do I make you change the project? I make you add some TDM, or I make you ride a bus, versus making this regional decision. So I guess my question is this really about trying to think more regionally?
So let me break it down between what happened with SB 375 and then what happened with SB 743. You kind of have to see the connection between those laws to see what the state's been doing and kind of how the state has looked at the problem. With SB 375, it was largely about this regional perspective, that from the land use and transportation sector, the best way to reduce the amount of vehicle travel and therefore the greenhouse gas emissions was to encourage local jurisdictions to assemble land use in much closer proximity and to build higher densities and to support it with transportation network decisions like walking and bicycling improvements or transit. So very regional in nature, and the MPOs did that. They put together plans that said if you assemble land uses in this fashion and you support it with transit projects, for example, VMT will reduce and so will greenhouse gases. Well, guess what? ARB has come along and checked them on how they're doing. And what they found is the local jurisdictions didn't follow that plan. The market for residential and retail and office development didn't follow the plan. It didn't match up well. Things still spread out. They still built more roadway projects than they had anticipated compared to the transit and bicycle and pedestrian projects. So VMT has continued to go up and greenhouse gas emissions with it. There was nothing in SB 375 that forced local jurisdictions to actually change land use at the local level. SB 743 because it directly changes CEQA, it starts to get at the land use authority and the transportation decision-making that local agencies have. And while it doesn't dictate to you how exactly you're going to do this type of analysis, the state has tried to incentivize that projects locating in these low VMT areas or next to transit would be given preferential treatment, the screening process, if you will. And what all that means is that for a project that's going through entitlement and going through environmental review, that's a big, expensive process. All the state's done is say, hey, for transportation impact analysis, you may not have to do any analysis anymore. So that $50,000 traffic study, you don't have to do that anymore. All your other entitlement costs, the millions of dollars you're going to spend on that part of it, and the rest of your environmental compliance costs, you still have to spend all that money. So that's not going to change the basic dynamics for where projects locate. So developers have a little bit of a CEQA relief through 743, but will it fundamentally change where projects locate and all the market conditions that influence those types of decisions? No.
A follow-up. I thought that we still had the ability to ask for LOS analysis also.
Yeah, so that's part of your entitlement process. So if in your general plan you retain a level service policy with a level service expectation, that expectation in the general plan is enforced when those projects come in and you go through entitlement review. And they may still have to do a traffic study. And instead of having CEQA impacts and mitigation measures, you would have level service deficiencies based on the general plan, and you would require conditions of approval to remedy that. So you could still do it. It's just done down that entitlement path and under the rules of entitlement versus what happens under CEQA. You really don't lose any leverage that you have under the general plan. And the general plan is your constitution. That's a very strong lever to require development, because development that's not consistent with the general plan either has to amend the general plan or get denied.
So again, sort of following up on this regional thought, if I'm a developer, before I even start spending money on an EIR, I'm going to think about, geez, it's going to be easier to meet this VMT in this location versus this other location, so it starts to encourage them to move in the direction we want versus just making it fit where they want to stick it.
There is a small incentive in that in going in one location that's low VMT generating, for example, they may not have to do any transportation impact analysis. All their other environmental costs, all their other entitlement costs have not changed. The only thing that's been reduced is that little bit of transportation impact analysis, and then any mitigation that may have come with it. In talking with the development community up and down the state, they have not given us any examples where they think this would be fundamentally different or a difference maker in their decision as to where to develop. It helps them in some locations because it means less analysis. No one wants to write a $50,000 check for a traffic study if they don't have to, but it doesn't change the fundamentals of real estate economics and where good places to develop are and what the most attractive places.
So we'll just wait for the next bill that's actually going to move us along that line then.
Well, that's why that little line we had of different state bills, the state continues to chip away, and I'm sure you've all followed SB 50. The state has continued to try and chip away at local land use control and transportation network decision making to try and align what's happening on the ground with the state's goals for things like greenhouse gas reduction. And that ARB report I mentioned is called the SB 150 report. If you haven't taken a look at it, it's worth a read because it actually maps what's been happening with VMT per capita over about the last 15 years. And despite the state's best efforts through SB 97, SB 375, AB 32, they've done a good job of reducing emissions from things like the power generation, electricity generation. But VMT per capita has actually been going up for the last few years. And that means the greenhouse gases from vehicle travel have also been going up, despite all the models in the state predicting that if they implemented these SB 375 plans, it would have been going down. And for us in the planning business, that's actually kind of the worst kind of mistake we can make, is to create a plan and then to create a forecast based on that plan and to suggest that there's a current trend line that says we're going to be heading downward and there's going to be a reduction in things. And not that we got the magnitude wrong, we got the direction of change wrong. Direction of change actually increased. So the state has kind of a big incentive to continue to try and chip away at they see as the things that are contributing to that increased VMT, and that is land uses continuing to spread apart, continued reliance on automobile travel, anything that does affect those things the state is looking at.
Councilmember Spector.
Thank you. First of all, good presentation. Thank you for that. Couple of questions more detailed than the prior ones, I believe. Did you say that the VMT would be or could be reevaluated or examined after a project is completed?
Yeah, so that's part of the monitoring that would come with mitigation. So if you choose to use something like TDM, and let's say you start off with the project needs to achieve a certain reduction after it's occupied, and it'll be monitored maybe once a year or twice a year to verify that they've actually met the VMT, let's call it a cap. In the Bay Area, there's a lot of projects that have trip caps today, vehicle trip caps. They can only generate a certain number of trips, and we monitor them sometimes twice a year. The same thing will happen with VMT if you want to use TDM. You're going to monitor the VMT, and monitoring VMT is hard because you don't just count the cars going in and out of the driveway. You have to know where they're going and how far they're going. So we have to use things like surveys, or we have to use mobile device data, so what we call big data. So there are ways to keep track of a project over time to make sure that they're performing to whatever cap you've put on the amount of VMT they generate.
So if we have, Los Gatos approves a large office complex, it's completed, a VTM number has been established, then it's completed, and the analysis would continue after the completion. And if I'm hearing you right, and if the vehicle travel VTM number increases, then that project would be required to come up with a methodology to reduce the trips?
Yeah, typically if you think of it as a menu of strategies, you would give them a long list, and in their first year they may pick one or two off the list that they feel would be appropriate. They'd be subjected to verification through the testing. If they're not meeting, it would likely trip the need to select additional strategies off the menu. And then depending on how aggressive you want to be, some agencies have even gone to fines. If you're not meeting your trip cap, for example, you could be fined. You could apply the same logic with VMT. The fine goes to something like a transportation management agency, where they would spend the money trying to reduce VMT from other nearby land uses as part of a sub-region typically would be one example. Now, this is dependent on, the reason you do TDM is because you're trying really hard to mitigate the impact down to a less than significant level. You could also decide that TDM is not feasible in our jurisdiction. There are a number of issues with TDM, not to mention the monitoring requirements, which are costly in some cases, but also the equity that it creates between the, let's say an office example. Existing office use, been there for 10 years, they don't have any TDM requirements. New office comes in, they have the fact that they got new construction costs, plus you've added TDM on top of it. So even if the buildings were very similar in quality, Class A space, the new building has a much higher per square foot cost, not just because it's new construction, but because you added the TDM program. So existing owners of office buildings may like that. It creates basically some differences in the property market, if you will, between new and old, because you've put the higher costs on the new stuff. Those are some considerations that you get into when you're thinking about these kinds of details.
All right, and last question. There are advantages, as you pointed out, to the VMT analysis if the project is near a traffic hub. One of the traffic hubs you referenced was a bus stop. How does the legislation or its implementation deal with bus stops that are not permanent, bus stops that could go away or change at a minimum?
Yeah, it doesn't deal with the fact that they could go away. Part of what they tried to do was first and foremost to recognize rail and ferry stations because they're a little more permanent. And then they only allowed bus stations where you have two routes crossing with peak 15-minute headways. Typically, if you have that level of frequency, there's relatively low risk that those types of routes would go away versus if you just had a single route, or if you had routes with, higher frequencies, like 30 minutes. There's definitely a chance that if the transit agency lost money and had to restructure its routes, it would start to take away some of those less utilized routes, and typically it'd be ones that have low frequency.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Vice Mayor.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. It's really interesting. I'm trying to figure out the tracking. So if I have a project that must go through an EIR and CEQA analysis, I have to apply these new VMT rules per the state law, correct?
Yeah.
And I, as a local jurisdiction, if it's an EIR project, my CEQA is going to reflect this analysis, the VMT that you're talking about. But it could also reflect some local discretionary call. So I was thinking while you're talking, well, do I get to throw away the ITE manual, or do I keep it for my entitlements, or is that my choice?
Yeah, so with the ITE, specifically the trip generation report, it's basically a compilation of trip generation rate studies that have been done around the U.S., typically in suburban locations with isolated land uses. A lot of transportation practitioners in the state of California will treat that as a default. It's their go-to. It's kind of easy to use because it covers lots of different land uses. But is it appropriate for CEQA? That's a question you can ask yourselves today. My answer as a practitioner that works on those legally challenged projects is no, it's not our default. It's our trip rates of last resort. An accompanying document's the IT Trip Generation Handbook. That handbook actually recommends use of locally valid rates and has a process by which you can collect a locally valid rate where you actually go out into the community and you do traffic counts to isolate the trips in and out of, let's say, a residential neighborhood or an office, and you can convert that then to a trip rate based on the number of units that are in the residential neighborhood, for example. We do that commonly, and when we do it and compare it to IT, we find significant differences in California. I'll give you one quick example. Davis, California, place known for its bicycling and walking. If you thought about, well, how does Davis compare to the ITE rates? These average rates are collected from these suburban communities with isolated land uses and very little biking or walking. So you think, well, Davis must be much lower. Average rate in ITE about 9.5 for a single family detached house. The Davis rates can range from about 10.5 to 11. Well, that's a big difference. Why is Davis actually higher than ITE? A couple reasons. High incomes. They own a lot of vehicles per household, and they shove a lot of college students into single-family homes. Land use context matters a lot. Incomes, for example, we have some communities we work where we have trip rates for a single-family home as high as 21. How do you get a 21? Well, they're wealthy neighborhoods that have gardeners, they have nannies, they have trainers, they have pool service, lots of different reasons for people coming to and from the homes. And now we have Amazon. Most of the IT rates that are in that book don't reflect what's been happening with internet shopping and Amazon trips to and from our homes. So don't think of the IT rates as a default. If you'd like to throw them out and collect locally valid rates, that's a perfectly appropriate and actually a recommended practice to ensure that the rates you're using are reflective of your community.
Follow up, if I might, a couple. Thank you, but if I determined that I wanted to just follow the California law and the CEQA practice, I wouldn't use those at all in any event, correct?
Yeah, so CEQA is based on substantial evidence to support your decisions. And so using the IT trip rates is one form of evidence. Can you provide better evidence? Yes, we can collect rates from our local community. That's better evidence, it's stronger evidence. So that's how they would be benchmarked against each other. Now, you never know exactly what a CEQA judge is going to do, and technically there's not such things as a CEQA judge per se, where they have unique expertise in law. There are a few of them. But when a lawsuit comes, typically what the judge is going to do is look at the strength of evidence as the basic way of understanding the analysis, and basically looking at whether or not use of a particular data set may have biased the analysis such that it's inadequate. It didn't raise to the bar the full protection of the environment. So in Davis, if I used IT rates, I run the risk of underestimating vehicle trips and underestimating the transportation impacts. That would be something that the judge would likely consider.
Okay, and one last thing, and then this is my last question. On the screening, when I listened to it, the screening sounds like it's designed not necessarily for location, except for if you're on a you would do a transit-oriented development, or you've got a, high-speed bus line or whatever you have, the half-mile radius. But a desired use as identified by the state. So the state is using screening as a word that I would use as they're exempting certain projects from further analysis because they think those are desirable. Am I correct in listening to you that it's up to the local jurisdiction what to screen and what not to screen, and that those things are guidance, quote unquote, from the state?
Yeah, so you don't have to use screening at all if you don't want to. If you want to subject every project to analysis so you understand what the impacts are, that is within your discretion to do. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of infill sites, and particularly those in a mixed-use environment, the neighbors oftentimes have a lot of concerns about what's going to locate there. And if they don't have complete information, it's hard for them to understand what the total set of effects are. To make the presumption that there is no transportation impact on VMT from that project may be appropriate in some cases, but not all cases. I'll give you one quick example. Anybody shop at Whole Foods as an example? Yeah, Whole Foods is kind of a popular place. It's a grocery store. Do you think people are willing to drive farther to a Whole Foods than a regular grocery store like a Safeway, for example? Yes. And we can measure that through some of our mobile device data. And if you think about specialty groceries, whether it's Trader Joe's, Whole Foods, you'll find that they can draw traffic from very far away if there is no competing Whole Foods or Trader Joe's nearby. So if that's the case, giving that project screening, you may have missed some opportunity there to potentially help reduce that large amount of travel that comes from their unique position in the marketplace. Same thing for any regional retail. Regional retail can derive from a large market, and you don't necessarily want to miss on the opportunity to achieve some VMT mitigation depending on how you value VMT reduction and greenhouse gas reduction and also air pollutants.
Councilmember Sayok?
If you could let's go back to screening. And a couple slides ago, you showed the threshold of what constitutes a significant impact. And you said that you could use, I think you said 15 VMTs, but you may use others like the Air Board, 16, newer development, maybe below. So is that a decision we make when we make these upcoming decisions? Or is there a default that we have to follow? And then the second is, how do you determine whether there's an impact? Are we doing baseline at a certain year, 2019, 2020? So if you could just walk me through the practicalities
I'll give you the
of that.
high-level ones, and this will be one of the topics that obviously gets brought back to you for more detail. Let's start with baseline. What are we comparing against? Baseline is a CEQA term. It typically or normally refers to the time at which the notice of preparation, the NOP, is released for a project. So if an NOP was released for a new project application in 2019, 2019 is our baseline. We're as close to it as we can get the data. So that's where we start from. In terms of your threshold choices, let me just give you a range for what's happened in the state already. So OPR has recommended a 15% reduction from baseline. ARB has recommended 16.8, two numbers that are just recommendations. In practice today, City of Pasadena was one of the first. They recommended that their threshold be that whatever the baseline level is. So new development, you just need to perform as well or better than existing development, looking at a citywide average. We've had some jurisdictions pick 10% because they didn't find that it was feasible to be able to reduce their VMT by 15%. We've had some that have adopted the 15%. We've had others that used a qualitative metric to say that our threshold is based on making sure that the project doesn't interfere with achieving the state's VMT and greenhouse gas reduction goals. They use that wording because today's 15% and 16.8 from the state, let's go out a year, 2020. VMT has continued to increase. The state's numbers are going to have to change. They're going to go up. So this comparison to baseline is potentially a floating number from the state's perspective because it's tied to their goals of hitting certain greenhouse gas targets. You may or may not share those same goals. So a lead agency has the discretion to set the bar from anywhere from zero, baseline, don't change baseline, to any amount of reduction that you expect a project to be able to achieve. That is within your discretion. There will be pressure, potentially for some jurisdictions. If you have an active environmental group, they may want to push for the state's goals, and that anything you're doing wouldn't interfere with the state achieving its goals. So a lot of communities look very closely at what OPR and ARB are recommending.
Councilmember Sack, you have one more?
I'm just curious, so VMTs, how do MTC, VTA, how do these agencies now design, how do they use VMTs as data as they start to do their upcoming plans? Do you know if there's even any synergy?
Okay, there is. So we've been using VMT as a metric for things like air quality analysis going all the way back to the 80s. We've had models that produce this metric. We added greenhouse gases and energy consumption as new ways that we use it. So we've been using VMT for a long time. So for SB 375, there's a very specific way we calculate VMT for the MPOs. For SB 743, what is being recommended is that we analyze VMT without respect to these model boundaries. We need to keep track of it going outside the model boundaries. So MTC or VTA, they don't have those same obligations. A lot of the work that they're doing for their regional transportation plan or SB 375 never required that. To comply with CEQA for purposes of their RTP EIR, for example, they will be expected to not, truncate the trip lengths. So we're working with a number of regional agencies today to modify their models so that they will be able to produce consistent VMT metrics, whether it's used for regional purposes or for a local agency's purposes. So yes, they will be consistent at some point. Today, though, in practice, there are some differences because of how the law's been evolving.
Councilmember Spector?
Thank you. Correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm sure you will. It seems like we may have some competing metrics here, and maybe it's because the legislation came in at different times. But if we assume that the vehicle miles traveled for new project is going to be more than what is there at the current time, and if we assume that additional vehicle miles traveled negatively impact the environment, that the number of vehicle miles traveled competes or conflicts with the objective of improving or addressing the environmental concerns. Am I missing the metrics there somehow?
Let me try and repeat that. What I think you're getting to is the fact that developing of any particular site, there's a lot of objectives in play. Think of your general plan. You've got multiple elements, lots of different goals and policies. You can think of those as objectives that the community is trying to achieve. I usually put them in like three simple buckets. What are you trying to protect? What are you trying to avoid? And what are you trying to create? Some of those objectives could be related to economic development. Some might be related to, so that's what you want to create. Some might be related to environmental protection. What are you trying to protect or avoid? And so on any given development site, you could have multiple objectives you're trying to achieve. And where VMT reduction fits depends on your community priorities. What the state has suggested so far is greenhouse gas reduction and VMT reduction are at the very high level of priorities for the state. Where they fit in a local community, when you have a lot of other objectives in that community, is still within your discretion to decide.
Thank you.
Commissioner Hanson?
Thank you. I wanted to go back to the thing that you said about screening. So I don't think this is entirely likely, but let's just say there's a very big affordable housing project that's nowhere near transit. So where does this balance fall between, and it generates a lot more vehicles miles traveled, although it gives us more affordable housing. So where does the law kind of come down on that? I mean, I understand we have discretion over how we do the VMT, but does that make sense, my question?
It does. This is one of the more challenging types of questions. If you think of this idea of screening, it's sometimes best to think of it as a teeter-totter. The benefit of screening is that it's literally a check-the-box approach. We're setting up methodology and tools today that take less than 5 minutes to screen a project. So very little analysis, and you get through the process quicker and cheaper. But you don't have much in the way of substantial evidence as to what the actual effects of that project are because you haven't analyzed it. So at the other end of the teeter-totter is CEQA risk. And you have a very high level of risk if you use screening because you don't have that complete information about what the project's actual effects are. For the state to say, hey, we think affordable housing projects should get the benefit of screening, that's looking through the state's lens. To a local community, if that project is going to generate trips on your network and you're concerned about those trips, then you may want to see the analysis of what that VMT is. And there can be a linkage here towards other community objectives. A lot of communities are usually more concerned about traffic as it relates to the delays and the travel times and the reliability of travel. And so one of the concerns we've heard is that there's a disconnect between what the state's doing with VMT and this community concern, and that's kind of why level service is still available to you through the entitlement process. But there's some other things you can do. You can measure VMT in the peak periods. So if you want to understand how much vehicle travel is going to increase during those peak periods when you're experiencing those delays, that's something that you could target as part of your metric. You could even mitigate for it and say, hey, of all the VMT that gets generated during the day, we'd really like to see the VMT generated during the peak hours. We'd really like to see that one reduced. So these are some of the things that do connect the dots here. And even for an affordable housing project, you may want to do the analysis because there may be some mitigation opportunities to reduce vehicle travel if that's important to the community.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
Councilmember Rennie.
I think it's a quick question. I just want to make sure I'm understanding, and I may have missed it if you connected it. In the beginning, you talked about trip-generated VMT and VMT effect. And then when we jump to talking about thresholds, it's not clear to me, we just keep using the term VMT. Are we talking about trip-generated or VMT effect or both somehow?
Yeah, so in the guidance from the state so far, they've recommended the 15% threshold is 15% reduction from baseline as applying to project-generated VMT. When you think about the project effect on VMT, that one can be a little simpler. So if you think about think of the general plan. So when you lay out a general plan and you've accounted for all the growth and the network changes, you've already planned for a certain amount of increase in VMT. It comes with your population and employment growth. When you do the project effect, the question you may want to be focused on is not a reduction, but just if a project is going to change an existing, maybe they're requesting a zoning change, does it change that absolute increase in VMT on the network? So we measured all the VMT in the city, did something like this, and let's say that's 1 million, the number's 1 million. The project effect on VMT, it could generate some new project trips, but it may lessen VMT elsewhere. So if we add it all up and look at it through this view, if it's still 1 million citywide, there is no effect, so there's no impact. So you may have a much simpler way of analyzing project effect versus what the state has suggested where you apply this 15% reduction threshold to something like VMT per capita.
So we have the option of using effect in our thresholds if we want.
Yeah, and it's not uncommon right now for us to recommend that you do both. So for project generated, you'll pick a threshold associated with that, and then for the project effect, it'll be a slightly different threshold, typically associated with that more long-term cumulative condition, where you're looking at, how does this project, in addition to everything else we're planning, how does it really affect things? And if you think about what development applications typically entail, developer shows up with an application to change either the general plan designation or change zoning. They're asking for an entitlement that isn't granted by the current zoning on the parcel. So they're asking you to change that. Doesn't guarantee they're ever going to build anything. Your decision process is changing land supply. you're basically, by designating a parcel with a certain amount of zoning, changes the amount of land supply in the city for certain types of uses to occur by right, a ministerial building permit approval. So when you make these decisions, you're making land supply decisions. So one of the better benchmarks is, does that project request for entitlement, does it fundamentally change what we've already planned? Is it more land use efficient? Does the project effect have on total VMT, does it go up or down? If it stays the same, you're fine, no difference in outcome. If it goes down, that's even better. If you want future decisions to be based on, your general plan, that's a good way to connect the dots.
Thanks.
Councilmember Sayok?
And this may be more a question of staff then. Tying this into general plan update, I'm assuming we have to do an EIR using VMTs now? Okay. Yes. Okay. And so where are we in that process? Still, we're not there yet?
Thank you. So we're not there yet, and
Okay.
we have been anticipating that for some time, so we'll be looking at opportunities to make sure that we catch this process up with that process so that it does not weigh down or lengthen the time for the EIR for the general plan.
Okay, thanks.
Vice Mayor?
It's a related question for staff, but if other people have questions for the speaker, I don't want to jump to staff.
The floor is yours.
Okay. I just wanted to ask, what is the track for these various tasks? Are we going to go through GPAC, Planning Commission, Town Council? Are we going to come straight to Town Council? How does the town anticipate that this is going to get before us for decisions?
So we had planned to stop at Planning Commission and a stop at the Town Council for each of these items.
And how does GPAC then think about with the general plan in putting things in? Because the speakers had a lot of focus on how our general plan relates to it. So have we thought about that?
So I would say, and maybe Matt has additional input, but I think this VMT metric is going to be based on the use. So we will have those caps and those ideas where the thresholds and the models will be applied to those as we move forward. So we think that will dovetail in. Obviously, we're open to direction if there's some other thoughts on path. We're on kind of a tight timeline, so it gets to be challenging to have a minimum of 3 meetings for every topic we have to discuss, but we're definitely open to suggestions.
Thank you.
All right, I just have one question for you. This kind of came to mind. In the good old days, it used to be in an office environment, maybe 1 or 2 employees per 1,000 square feet of office space. And now it's usually about 4 or 5 people. So even though, they may be arriving on public transit and stuff, just the sheer number of people who might be driving from, say, Los Gatos or somewhere to the Google campus in downtown San Jose, there will be more vehicle miles traveled. In an example like that, has the state considered anything about the smaller workspaces and the amount of people who will be working in a, like a corporate campus, like a...
The state hasn't, but it gets back to the question regarding the IT trip rates. These IT trip rates that come to us from around the U.S. don't reflect the level of employee density that we have in the South Bay, for example. This is where it's really important to collect your own local data so that you make sure that the trip rates are really capturing that unique local context. The same thing applies for trip lengths. That's the other part of the equation here for VMT, is how far people are willing to travel. With the housing supply shortfall that does exist in parts of the Bay Area, we do know there are very long distance commuters that come all the way from the Central Valley. So if you're using an average trip length that might have come out of a model that cuts off at the boundary between the Bay Area and the San Joaquin Valley, you will definitely underestimate the VMT. So there's other sources of data we can go to make sure we've captured the full length of those trips. So this is one of the areas of practice that's quickly evolving. We're trying to get better at both the trip generation and the trip length so that the VMT estimates are accurate.
Thank you. Mr. Rennie?
Another one I just thought of. So in generating your models, one way to do it is using cell phones, right, tracking where people have gone. But it just dawned on me, if an Apple bus picks up 20 people in Los Gatos and takes them up, it's one trip, but you have 20 cell phones that just made the trip. So, and that gets to the whole TDM thing. You can't even measure if TDM's being effective. Is there some way to figure out that 20 people rode a bus in one vehicle? Or what if we suddenly get all start carpooling somehow, right? How are you accounting for that?
Yeah, those are definitely important questions. So when it comes to the utilization of vehicles and how we're able to measure it, using the cell phone devices is tricky, because not only do you have maybe multiple devices, in the bus, for example, but a lot of people have more than one device. And the way the cell phone signals and those kinds of things work, you may be picking up 2 different cell phones for the same person plus their iPad. So those are all issues that you have to kind of sort through, and sometimes nothing replaces doing a basic survey where you actually onboard surveys, for example. There are new technology that do look at things for the individual vehicles where they use cameras to try and detect occupancy, but those are still developing and still have kind of high error rates. So this is an area that we definitely need better data, better methods of collecting that data, because it will matter. How many people are in the vehicle when you're trying to do these estimates.
Thanks.
Councilmember Sack?
I think this is my last one. So we've spent a lot of time discussing about the quality of data and how it would be nice to have better and more. Obviously, there's a cost associated with that. So are you aware of any state funds to offset these increased costs to municipalities?
So there are state funds, planning grants typically, that are being used for things like developing better models. Using those to actually collect data for an individual project, no. They're typically used for very specific applications that would be broader than an individual project. So most individual projects are kind of on their own in terms of collecting the data. But the town does have a lot of discretion in terms of what you expect from a developer that's going to request an entitlement and go through the environmental review process. There's limits probably within financial reason, but CEQA uses those expectations I had up earlier, fullest possible protection of the environment, and those other expectations. What you didn't see in the list was a financial one, only analyzed to the extent financially feasible for the developer. That's not one of the criteria that's looked at in terms of what's legally defensible.
All right. I see no other questions at this time from the council and the commission, so we will thank you for your presentation for the moment and go to the public. If anybody wishes to speak on this item, I have no cards at present. I don't see any coming forward, so we'll close the public hearing and we'll go back to our council and our planning commission for any additional comments or questions. And I see none, so I suppose that means we are adjourned. Thank you for everybody this evening.
I do have a
Vice
question, I'm
Mayor
sorry.
has a question.
Can we get a copy of your presentation, or does staff have it? so
Yes,
that
we
we
have it.
can
We'll make it available to
Get
you.
it? That would be great.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
All right. Anything else? Seeing none, thank you everybody for your participation in their presentations this evening.